The night vision granted by the Red Bishop and the Black Knight made reading after dark effortless. Ed flipped through the book before him, and what had once been obscure and difficult suddenly felt astonishingly simple. He read it again from the start, and the parts that had been incomprehensible before now flowed in order through his mind, as if a steady stream of understanding were gushing out. He closed the book, hungry for more, and only then realized it was already morning. What a strange feeling, he thought. He felt a little dizzy, but not overtired. After a moment's thought, he said, "I'll nap for a bit. Wake me for breakfast, okay?" The Red Bishop and Black Knight cawed twice, indicating they understood. Confident, Ed shut the book and prepared to sleep. The soul crystals he'd been absorbing left him remarkably refreshed. Even staying up all night only produced a mild weariness. He needed rest more to preserve his edge during the day than because he was exhausted. He planned to spend the day in the library again, though at night he wanted to clear dungeons and absorb more soul crystals to boost his intelligence. After taking in so many crystals, he reckoned his resistance to the Wraith Mage's abilities had risen. Maybe tonight he could get past that room and push on to the next. That chamber housed 6 Wraith Mages, which meant at least 3 soul crystals. If he cleared it, his haul would increase by a third compared to the 9 crystals he'd collected the previous night. A week passed. Ed filled almost every spare moment with charms practice or devouring books in the library. Lately, he'd even given up practicing charms in the room of requirement. The surge in his intelligence had come with an even greater hunger to learn, and he lost himself in reading. When comprehension comes easily and memory locks things in at once, learning becomes addictive. Hermione, who accompanied him to the library every day, noticed the change most sharply. Ed's reading rate had exploded, from half a book every few days to 1, 2, 3, even 4 books in the same span, and Hermione could confirm he wasn't skimming. He truly understood what he read. Once, skeptical of his sudden speed, she plucked questions directly from the textbooks to test him, only to leave feeling slightly foolish and a little shaken by how far ahead he'd suddenly moved. The professors noticed too. Early rapid progress could be excused by Ed's summer of self-study and raw ability. With proper instruction, it was natural to convert that private study into visible improvement. But his acceleration continued past that point. Almost every lesson brought a visible leap forward. In a single week, he advanced more than many first years managed in a year, and the staff were astonished. Professor McGonagall was so incensed she stormed into Dumbledore's office and had a furious argument with the Sorting Hat, as though she wanted to rip it apart. The Hat, wisely, fell silent and did not answer. Only Professor Flitwick seemed perpetually cheerful. Ravenclaw had seized first place in the House Cup, and even Professor Snape's opportunistic additions to Slytherin couldn't close the gap. Ravenclaw led by over 150 points. Snape had started picking at Ravenclaw's students as relentlessly as he did Gryffindor's, trying every angle to shave points off their house. But Ravenclaw's pupils weren't reckless. Their competence in potions left Snape little to exploit. He could only siphon off a few negligible points here and there, which did nothing to stem the tide. As a professor, he could only award a dozen or so points at a time, far short of the hundreds he'd have liked to gift Slytherin in one go. Even without flurries of points from Quirrell or Snape, Ed kept earning marks from other teachers. Ravenclaw, in a way they hadn't seen for years, was suddenly within reach of the top spot in the House Cup. With the school year barely a month old, hope had been rekindled among the young Eagles. Chapter 82. Stuck Again. Immediately, the learning atmosphere in Ravenclaw grew even more competitive than before. The common room had been full of studious young witches and wizards, but now there were even more people, especially Ravenclaw seniors. They had quietly conceded that this new junior was exceptional, but as seniors, they couldn't fall too far behind. They wouldn't let the junior charge ahead alone and take all of Ravenclaw's glory. Every point counted, and every point might help make up for what Snape had deducted from the house. The pressure spread to the other houses. Professors started assigning slightly more homework. Snape went into overdrive, deducting points left and right. Hufflepuff, as usual, had quietly given up, always last, so a few points here or there didn't matter, and Snape had even begun to ignore them entirely. Gryffindor, on the other hand, shifted focus to Quidditch. McGonagall increased homework, but she gave the team the green light for extra practice and privileges like extended access to the pitch. Even if Gryffindor couldn't win the House Cup this year, they had to at least reclaim the Quidditch Cup. With Potter on the team and Wood's near-perfect evaluation, McGonagall felt confident that they could win. She even gave Potter extra tutoring and discreetly turned a blind eye to Hermione's occasional cheating to help Harry and Ron. In that tense, high-pressure atmosphere, Aid kept up his daily, almost monotonous routine, studying in the common room, attending classes, going to the library, clearing dungeons in the evenings, absorbing soul crystals. His life had become almost linear. He had less contact with Harry and the others. He'd been busy improving himself and didn't have much time to interact. Harry didn't notice much change either. He'd been swallowed up by Quidditch training and was busy enough. Hermione felt a little odd about it, but at least she could still see Aid in the library during the day. What surprised her was that he no longer went to the library at night. Hermione guessed, correctly in a way, that this scoundrel must be secretly working hard after lights out. She resolved to read a few more books herself. She couldn't afford to fall behind. Aid really was secretly busy at night, but not in the way Hermione imagined. He was secretly grinding game content. He let out a long breath and said, "Wow, I finally cleared the Ravenclaw dormitory." Compared with the male common room, the Ravenclaw female common room was even more crowded with wraith mages, Ravenclaw's yin dominating yang. Almost the moment he pushed open the door, a dozen wraith mages unleashed a barrage of spells at his face. Fortunately, after absorbing so many soul crystals, his character's stun resistance had improved. The bursts of soul screams still slowed his movement, but he could still find time to dodge and counterattack. After clearing the last common room, Aid finally breathed a sigh of relief. Soul crystals still helped, but not as dramatically as before. His body wasn't saturated, but the returns had diminished. It was like the magic affinity potion. Its effect had weakened, but it still helped. He'd settled into a routine of using 6 soul crystals and 1 bottle of magic affinity potion each day. With the overall increase in soul crystals, the daily intake for Red Knight and Black Bishop had risen from 1 per bird to 5, and the 2 familiar birds were ecstatic. They even seemed a size larger, with eyes sharper and smarter, more hawk than raven, though the change was subtle enough that most of the younger students didn't notice. The Red Bishop and Black Knight had always been a bit different from ordinary ravens, so no one paid much attention. Aid hadn't only been clearing Hogwarts dungeons, he'd sometimes gone back to refarm the Scarlet Monastery dungeon to keep a steady stock of magic affinity potion. By now, his supply of soul crystals was almost maxed out. Despite clearing so many dormitories, he had found only 1 raven's proof. The other 8 remained missing. He wasn't worried. Clearing all the dormitories across the 4 houses would likely turn them up. Confident after finishing Ravenclaw's dormitory, he drank health and stamina potions to restore his character and strode out into the common room, only to be greeted by a flood of combat prompts. You encountered the monster, monster book. You encountered the monster, goblin book. You encountered the monster, elf book. Aid stared at the screen full of grinning book faces, the way books had become monsters in some bestiary. Hundreds of small, crazed book creatures were rushing toward him. He froze for a moment and muttered, "Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing?" Strictly speaking, these book monsters were weak, like the ghost children he'd faced on the first floor of the Scarlet Monastery. The problem wasn't their strength. There were just so many of them. Hundreds of monster books surged forward and instantly drained Ed's in-game character's health bar. Even when he cast Incendio to raise a wall of fire, it didn't help. The blazing wall was simply overrun by the fearless swarm. Then a line of text popped up on the screen. "Victory and defeat are common in war. Brave warrior, please try again." "Damn it," Ed snapped, closing the game interface. He took out his daily soul crystal and a potion of magical affinity and swallowed them both. For the moment, he put the problem of the 100-odd monster books aside and focused on absorbing the crystal and potion to boost his potential. The next day, he sought out Professor Flitwick to ask about the shield charm. He'd realized the problem. The number of monster books was the real threat. Even if each one was weak, hundreds or thousands of them could swarm and empty a health bar in no time. What he needed was defense, not more attack. He already had plenty of offensive charms. The obstacle curse could repel a few small creatures, but it couldn't stop a flood of monster books. Likewise, offensive spells couldn't handle so many at once. He'd be torn apart before he killed a fraction. Even a wide wall of fire like Incendio was useless against such overwhelming numbers. But as a D+ difficulty dungeon, it didn't make sense for the challenge to be unbeatable. The monster books were numerous but weak. They relied on attrition. If he could master a powerful defensive charm, he'd be an iron fortress against them. The shield charm immediately came to mind. As one of the most practical defensive charms in the wizarding world, it was notoriously difficult but invaluable. At very high skill, it was said to be able to withstand an unforgivable curse. Whether it could truly stop an Avada Kedavra depended on the duelists involved, but the point was clear. The shield charm offered formidable protection. According to its description, casting the shield charm on yourself was like donning a sturdy suit of armor. It resisted both magical and physical attacks, and as long as the shield held it remained protective. Best of all, you could layer shields, casting additional shield charms onto an existing one to stack defenses. Ed hadn't rushed to learn it before because he'd relied on the obstacle curse, which was both offensive and defensive and handled most situations. His in-game avatar didn't suffer reduced combat effectiveness from injuries. As long as the health bar wasn't empty, he could keep fighting. A health potion could always patch him up after a fight. And frankly, the shield charm was very difficult, harder than any charm he'd learned so far. So, learning other charms had seemed more efficient. He'd concentrated on other charms and put the shield charm off for later. Now circumstances demanded flexibility. Learning the shield charm had to be brought forward. There was no real downside to doing so. He was already a powerful, well-trained wizard in the game. If he could cast the shield charm on himself, he'd be a heavily armored fighter with explosive power and raven-like agility, a melee nightmare for other wizards, perfectly suited to his role as a Ravenclaw Fist Saint. More practically, the shield charm would let him stand safe and cast spell barrages from the rear. Ed shook off the jumble of thoughts and listened as Professor Flitwick explained the shield charm. A former dueling champion, Flitwick was naturally very skilled with shields and seemed mildly surprised at how far Ed had progressed. After checking Ed's record in other charms, the professor nodded with clear satisfaction. Among his students, Ed stood out. He never needed fussing over and kept bringing surprises. It was astonishing that a little wizard, enrolled for only a month, was tackling such advanced magic, but testing showed there was no problem. A genius should be treated like a genius. Better to guide him and spare him detours than to let him fumble. Learning charms wasn't like studying the dark arts, so there was no reason to hide his progress. Ed felt he'd gained a lot from Flitwick's explanation, but as he thought it over more deeply, a few confusions remained. Noticing Ed's thoughtful expression, Professor Flitwick didn't interrupt. He quietly left the charm's classroom, leaving Ed alone to continue thinking. Miss Granger was the loudest about Ed's growing secrecy. She was still the one who talked to him most often, meeting him in the library during the day, so she was the first to notice he'd become withdrawn. But Hermione was prickly about his silence. "Damn him," she muttered, stabbing a tiny piece of steak on her plate as if it were the cause of all her grievances. "He's been sneaking off to study at night. That's why he's improving so fast." Harry and Ron knew better than to argue. Hermione's suspicions weren't new. She always complained that Ed must be working late behind everyone's backs. Harry felt she had no standing to criticize. Ed looked fresh and energetic all day, while Hermione wore dark circles from her own late nights. She hauled a huge stack of books back to the Gryffindor common room every evening, and her roommates confirmed, read under the covers with a flashlight after lights out. When Ed finally appeared in the Great Hall, Harry waved him over. "What have you been up to lately?" he called. Ed blinked, surprised to be noticed, then smiled. "I've been studying some more advanced spells." Harry and Ron leaned in. Spells that could stump Ed had to be substantial. Given that Ed had been practicing Incendio and the like before, the boys guessed he meant something that took time and focus. Combat spells? Ron asked. Ed shook his head. Shield charm. Hermione's fork clattered to her plate. You're working on shield charm already? It's supposed to be a post-OWL thing, she added, incredulous. Ed admitted it wasn't easy. I've been trying to learn it, but it's tricky. And with learning spells, you quickly want to test them, so the library isn't ideal. Shield charm isn't dangerous, so I just practiced in my dorm. That made sense. Ed lived in a dormitory by himself. Ravenclaw had far fewer boys, and everyone knew the dorm was private. The others nodded, and with the Quidditch match imminent, their attention shifted. Ravenclaw's match against Slytherin was about to start again, and Oliver Wood had been more on edge than usual. He'd made it clear this old rivalry had to be settled. Wood had been dragging Harry out to practice whenever he could. Professor Flitwick had even asked Ed if he'd consider joining the Quidditch team, but Ed had declined after thinking about it. It wasn't a ridiculous suggestion. Ed's flying was excellent, and Ravenclaw knew it, but joining wouldn't solve Ravenclaw's bigger problem. When Harry had filled the last spot on Gryffindor's team, the team became genuinely dangerous. Wood was a brilliant keeper, the Weasley brothers controlled the field, the Chasers scored well, and Harry himself could end a game at a moment's notice by catching the snitch. Ravenclaw, by contrast, was simply too weak across the board. Even if Ed could find the golden snitch in a flash, a seeker alone can't win a match if the rest of the team gets torn apart. Quidditch is a team sport. One player's brilliance can't overcome a serious overall deficit. Besides, Ed was busy. He didn't have time for a pastime that wouldn't change Ravenclaw's fortunes, and he wasn't the sort to scatter his efforts. By now, the ambitions of the four houses were clear. Gryffindor was going all out for the Quidditch Cup, determined to wrest it from Slytherin. Ravenclaw aimed to take back the House Cup that Slytherin had held for 7 years. Professor Snape, who had kept trophies proudly displayed in his office for years, didn't look like a man eager to relinquish either prize. Snape's temper showed in his marking. He was ready to dock points mercilessly whenever Gryffindor or Ravenclaw slipped up. Gryffindor, with its band of academic underachievers, had become his favorite target and suffered heavy deductions. Ravenclaw fared better. Its students rarely called attention to themselves in Snape's class, and that at least kept them from losing points. Hufflepuff, under Professor Sprout, continued in their accustomed role, amused spectators. Used to being near the bottom, they watched Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin fight tooth and nail. With Snape preoccupied hunting for faults among the rivals, Sprout's students enjoyed a comparatively peaceful Potter-style life. No pursuit, no pressure. Professor Flitwick shook his head with a hint of regret, but given the state of the Ravenclaw team, he didn't press it. He smiled and told Ed that once the Ravenclaw squad strengthened in a few years, Ed could even take up more activities on the Quidditch pitch. He added the usual consolations about young wizards not putting too much pressure on themselves and joining in more games and activities. Ed, you're already excellent, he said. Ed smiled and nodded. Professor Flitwick was truly kind and affable. Because Ed had often asked Flitwick for time off, the two had grown quite familiar. Flitwick now treated Ed almost like a favored student. Nearly any question Ed had, Flitwick could answer. Ed was grateful for a professor of such stature. Another point worth mentioning was Ed's relationship with the caretaker, Filch, and Filch's cat, Madame Norris. Several times when Filch went to fetch Madame Norris, he found she had run off to Ed to beg for dried fish, which made Filch's expression spectacularly miserable, like someone who'd spent years tending a prize cabbage only to have a pig ruin it. Even after Filch angrily scolded Madame Norris and told her not to visit that first year again, she always seemed to forget and would be sitting by Ed the next time she disappeared. Filch brooded about it. After a few conversations about Madame Norris's dislikes and little habits, Ed persuaded Filch to try a different approach. Filch did so skeptically, and his impression of Ed improved noticeably. It wasn't full-on protectiveness, but at least Filch no longer singled him out the way he did other students. Ed didn't push the change. Slow progress was fine. He wasn't doing anything illicit, it was easy enough for Filch to look the other way. The 8th floor, which ordinary students rarely visited, was a place Ed frequented. He still bumped into Filch on patrol sometimes, but Filch no longer glared at him like he did with troublemakers. He pretended not to see him, and that was already a relief. Shield charm, Ed silently intoned, and a thin sheet of magic sprang up around him. He held it for a while, then let out a long breath. He had finally mastered the shield charm. Having been enrolled for just over 2 months, Ed had unexpectedly learned most of the basic charms every student had to know, and a number of more advanced ones too, like the shield charm. His progress had been remarkably fast. Now that he could cast the shield charm reliably, the next step was long-term practice in the room of requirement to raise its power and durability. The room contained training aids for defensive magic, dummies and contraptions that continuously hurled balls at trainees. The balls didn't cause much harm, but when they struck a student, they burst into quick-fading magical paint, leaving the student splattered and disheveled. The embarrassment pushed them to focus harder on their defenses. Ed liked the punishment mechanism. Even though he already concentrated when practicing, a little extra pressure made him more realistic and disciplined. Practicing the shield charm under tension was closer to its use in real combat and helped him develop rhythm and proficiency. In a good mood, and unusually for him, Ed decided not to spend the rest of the day studying or drilling charms. Instead, he went to the Quidditch pitch to watch Harry practice. After all, Harry was a close friend, and they hadn't spent much time together recently. Friendships still needed nurturing. Professor Flitwick's words echoed in his mind too. Young wizards should join in group activities. It was also sensible to balance work and rest. Constant strain wasn't healthy. Since he'd made a breakthrough with the shield charm, a half-day off felt well-deserved. Harry was genuinely pleased Ed had come to watch. He trained harder than ever and insisted that Ed must be there to cheer him on the next time they played Slytherin. Ed agreed without hesitation. He remembered that in the next match, Harry's broom would act up. Nothing disastrous in the original timeline, but Ed felt better knowing he'd be present. With the Red Bishop and the Black Knight around, Harry would be safer even if a fall happened. After watching for a while, Ed slipped away from the pitch and returned to the Ravenclaw common room. He took out the guitar he hadn't touched in a long time. The case was spotless, clearly attended to by a house elf. He ran his fingers over the instrument that had been with him for years and felt a quiet pang of emotion. Chapter 86. Beware the Headmaster's Malicious Extra Points. Looking back, it had been just over a year since I started life as a street performer. I never would have expected that. Only a year later, I'd be studying magic at Hogwarts. I hadn't even taken this old instrument, the guitar I used to carry everywhere, out in ages. After a moment's thought, I slung it over my back, left the Ravenclaw common room where the first years were quietly reading, and wandered the castle until I found an empty spot. I sat and began to play, humming a few lines. The Red Bishop and the Black Knight, my 2 chess piece companions, seemed to remember as well. They danced around me to the music. They hadn't heard this tune in a long time, and the moment their master played it again, they brightened as if they'd been made whole. Only after I left did a translucent figure materialize from the terrace wall where I'd been playing. Not a person, but the Ravenclaw ghost, the Grey Lady. She lingered on the terrace for a little while as if savoring the last notes, then turned and melted back into the wall. A new day dawned, and the castle buzzed with life. The first years chattered excitedly about the upcoming festival. It took me a beat to realize Halloween was coming. Life in the orphanage had been lean, and I never paid much attention to holidays like that. I'd barely celebrated them in either life. Hearing everyone talk, I remembered how important Halloween was to students here. It brought people together, and celebrating it at Hogwarts would make the younger ones feel more at home. No wonder the staff and students were taking it seriously. Professor Flitwick smiled and gave Ravenclaw a house task. Help decorate the Great Hall and the corridors for Halloween. It was a big job that required solid charms work. Many of the older students were buried in their OWLs and had no time. First years simply didn't have the skill. In years past, Flitwick had handled these things himself, but this time he cheerfully handed the responsibility to me and attached a reward, 50 house points for Ravenclaw on completion. Ravenclaw was already in the lead. We were ahead of second-place Slytherin by 200 points. Adding another 50 would make it extremely difficult for Snape to turn things around, even if he tried every trick in the book. I suspected Flitwick had that in mind. But I also worried. The real threat to Ravenclaw wasn't Slytherin, it was Gryffindor, sitting about 350 points behind us. That didn't look like a giant gap, but it wasn't safe. I did the math in my head. What if Dumbledore decided to hand out a huge chunk of points to the famous Gryffindors? 200 for the boy who lived, 100 for Miss Granger's brilliance, 100 for Ron's loyalty, 100 for Neville as encouragement. That's 500 in one go. I had no doubt about Dumbledore's integrity, yet I figured Ravenclaw needed at least a 600-point cushion to feel secure. If we led by that much, even Dumbledore would think twice before showering Gryffindor with points and blatantly awarding them the House Cup. If all that still couldn't secure us the cup, well, I joked with myself that I'd give up next year. At least Flitwick couldn't blame me. I would have done everything I could. Besides, I couldn't stand idly by. I was friends with Harry and the others now. When trouble came, they'd think of me first. I'm not the kind to abandon my friends. My thoughts were still buzzing as I waved my wand and set to work. Ribbons, balloons, and garlands sprang into being and began to drape the great hall and corridor ceilings. Other older students from the houses had come too, responsible prefects answering the call of their deans. Ordinary students could skip it, but prefects couldn't. The difference between my magic and theirs was obvious. Though I was younger, their chests heaved with the effort, while I kept casting one charm after another without tiring. Part of that was raw magical capacity. Part was practice. My command of these simple charms had become frighteningly refined. Professor Flitwick watched, smiling, and said that in a year or two my skill with basic charms might even rival his. Don't underestimate what he meant. Flitwick's own charms ability was high, nearly always at or above level 6, so his compliment carried weight. In truth, when it came to everyday charms, Flitwick felt very few students at Hogwarts could match me. He just hadn't expected my magical reservoir to be so abundant. While the other little wizards were still resting, Ed, who had been assigned more corridors and halls than any of them, had already finished his rounds. He hummed cheerfully, grabbed a book, and headed back to the Ravenclaw common room to study. Even so, everything had taken him nearly half a day. There was no complaint in it. On one hand, it reinforced his charms practice, and on the other, it was a solid contribution to Ravenclaw. As a Ravenclaw, he still had that basic sense of honor. Earning over 50 points for his house in less than an afternoon felt efficient. He even considered asking Professor Flitwick for more tasks to bank another 100 or two. Flitwick hesitated when Ed brought it up, then politely refused. He wasn't Snape. He looked embarrassed by the idea of an obvious point grab. Ed sighed inwardly. Flitwick was too kind. Maybe the professor thought the House Cup was already secured. That would be like celebrating at halftime. Ed couldn't bring himself to tell Flitwick how Dumbledore might behave at the end of term. He resolved instead to keep trying to earn points for Ravenclaw, at least to give the house every chance. Flitwick had been so good to him, as Dean Ed wanted Ravenclaw to win the cup at least once. When the Halloween feast began, Ed had assumed that his earlier interventions would change how Hermione, Harry, and Ron interacted. This Halloween ought to pass without incident. He scanned the tables and his heart tightened when he didn't see Hermione. What the hell? He wondered whether history's inertia was stronger than he thought, or if Dumbledore had meddled again. He shoved a few more mouthfuls of food into his mouth, uneasy. Then the huge doors of the great hall burst open. Exactly as he'd half expected, a man in a shabby turban stumbled into the center of the room. Conversation died. Professor Quirrell, limping and overacting, dragged himself up onto the raised platform and cried in a high, panicked voice, "Troll! Troll! There's a troll loose in the dungeons! Dumbledore, I thought you should know!" He collapsed with a heavy thud. Ed frowned. Quirrell's performance was too exaggerated to be natural. The man looked as if he were putting on a show. Yet when the staff reacted, none of the professors looked shocked or suspicious. Dumbledore rose slowly, waved for Quirrell to be carried away, and the prefects hurried the students back to their common rooms. That indifference chilled Ed. So many things about Quirrell had always seemed odd. On paper, an excellent Hogwarts graduate, and yet incapable of running a proper defense against the dark arts class. Teachers who had once trained him would remember his former competence. Even if he hadn't been exceptional, he shouldn't be this bad. And yet the faculty's silence suggested something they weren't saying. A new possibility formed in Ed's mind. Perhaps Dumbledore already knew. Perhaps the headmaster understood that Lord Voldemort had infiltrated Hogwarts and that Quirrell was his host. That alone would not have surprised him. These were, after all, things one could deduce. What made Ed uneasy was a subtler thought. Quirrell might not be fully controlled. Some remnant of his will could still be fighting Voldemort for control, which would explain the spasms and odd theatrics Ed had just seen. Those gestures might be cries for help. At that realization, Ed stood up without thinking. Quirrell had been calling, pleading, trying to make Dumbledore see his strangeness, begging for rescue from the Dark Lord. The idea that someone could be trapped like that, silently screaming for aid, gripped Ed like an ice hand. Had Dumbledore seen it? If so, why did he do nothing? Was Quirrell beyond saving? Was there some advantage to letting him fall, using him as a stepping stone to force Harry into the role of savior? Or was Dumbledore simply unwilling to save him? Ed's stomach turned. He wanted to believe the first explanation, that Dumbledore had a plan, however terrible the cost. From Dumbledore's portrayal in the books, the headmaster was an impeccable elder, caring for Harry in every way, the sort of mentor who would do anything for his students. Ed swallowed hard. He couldn't know the truth. He closed off the questions and clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stop thinking further. Chapter 88. The professor disappeared at the critical moment. Making baseless assumptions about someone was the worst thing. Ed forced himself not to link the Dumbledore he saw now with the one of Dumbledore's past, simply because that older Dumbledore had once dabbled in darker arts. He drew a steadying breath. For the past 7 years, Dumbledore had seemed, if anything, like a kindly old man approaching the end of his life. Gentle, harmless, and full of goodwill toward the students. He mustn't panic. Quirrell had been beyond hope, surely. If Dumbledore were truly invincible, how could he have been felled by the curse from that ring? Dumbledore was a great wizard, not a god. He had limits. Even at the height of his reputation, he had only barely held his own against Tom Riddle. That was partly because so many factors constrained him, and partly because Dumbledore never had an absolute advantage against Voldemort. Even in the Ministry battle, he only managed to tip the scales after Voldemort had just been reborn and his power was still reduced, and some Horcruxes had unknowingly been destroyed, weakening him further. As Ed turned those thoughts over, Harry, Ron, and Neville came running up, breathless and panicked. "What's wrong?" Ed asked. "Where's Hermione? Where is Hermione?" Harry blurted. "Did Hermione and you lot have a row?" Neville asked, wide-eyed. Ed understood why they might think that. In the original story, Hermione's manner often triggered flare-ups among them. But this time, the friendships had improved. They were true pals now, so Ed had not expected a fight. He'd even warned Hermione beforehand, but that hadn't prevented this. Harry gasped a few times, trying to calm. "When we were leaving, Hermione said she was tired and wanted to rest a little," he explained. He hesitated. "Her roommate says she's been reading secretly in the dorm after lying down. She's exhausted." Ron, puffing, managed a few words between breaths. Ed pieced it together. "She said she'd come later?" "Yeah. But, all right, don't say any more," Ed cut in, nodding. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "What else? Find a professor." The three Gryffindors exchanged looks, and predictably, their Gryffindor courage flared. "We wanted to find a professor, but we can't find any," Ron said. Of course, the professors had scattered through the castle to search for the wandering troll, and prefects were shepherding the students back to their common rooms. No one in charge was anywhere to be seen. Even Dumbledore had mysteriously vanished. Ed half expected the headmaster to be standing right in front of them, disguised by a disillusionment charm, watching the conversation. He wanted to laugh and protest. "This is entrapment." Hermione was probably on her way to the Great Hall because she was late, Ed thought. The three of them nodded, faces becoming grim. The thought of Hermione running into a troll by accident was too frightening to picture. Ed scanned the corridors again. Still no professors. There wasn't much else to say. "Let's go," he said quietly. Harry and Ron agreed. If they went hunting for a professor now, it could already be too late. Besides, their instinct as Gryffindors was to act first, and the professors, it seemed, were nowhere to be found when action was most needed. Ed suspected, more than suspected, that whatever Dumbledore's plan was, it was working like clockwork. He was certain now. He led Harry and the others toward the Gryffindor common room, following a route he knew well. As they ran, Ed pulled a small slip of parchment from his pocket, scribbled a few lines, and tucked it into the gauntleted hand of the little Black Knight chess piece perched on his shoulder. "Go find Professor Flitwick," he instructed the enchanted piece. "If you can't find Flitwick, any professor will do. Give them this note." No matter Dumbledore's motives, the fact remained that Harry and the others were breaking school rules. Harry and Ron probably didn't care. Dumbledore had arranged a lot of things for them, rules being one of them. But why should a diligent Ravenclaw like Ed be the one who had to pick up the blame? He had already drafted the note to warn Professor Flitwick. Ravenclaw's points were high this term. He wasn't going to let the House Cup slip away over this. Ed wasn't overly worried about Hermione's safety. If this was truly Dumbledore's design, she'd probably be fine. Though he admitted she might get a terrible fright. Or maybe she hadn't made it to the feast because she was genuinely exhausted. It could also be that she'd been hit by a weak sleeping charm. Otherwise, the timing, wanting to lie down right then, waking halfway through the feast and dashing off, would be too coincidental. A tangle of possibilities turned over in Ed's mind, but Harry and the others had no idea. From their point of view, it was panic and action, not chessboard-level strategy. Dumbledore's plan, whatever it was clever enough that only someone who stepped back and looked at the whole board would see it. For now, they sprinted on, driven by alarm and bravado, while Ed hoped the little Black Knight would find a professor in time. Chapter 89. Dumbledore is not a human being. Ed stayed silent. He couldn't pretend to know everything. He only had to act in keeping with his role. He reached up, patted the Red Bishop on the shoulder, and said, "Tell your brothers to start looking for Hermione Granger and that troll." The Red Bishop gave a sharp caw, launched itself through a nearby window, and its cry echoed through Hogwarts like a signal. More caws answered from all over Gryffindor Tower. The castle filled with the sound. The Raven contingent began to move. Ed smiled at the stunned Harry and the others. "Don't reveal my secret," he said. They nodded gravely. They had thought Ed's Red Bishop and Black Knight were impressive, but they hadn't expected them to command all the ravens in Hogwarts. As the birds seemed to pour from every corner of the castle, Harry, Ron, and Neville felt a chill. No wonder Ed wasn't just hiding in his common room reading all the time. He had means to know things that happened across the school. The ravens would be his eyes everywhere. Harry and Ron brightened. While they might not find Hermione by themselves, with Raven scouts combing the castle, it was likely she would be located. Hermione's cleverness might even get her out of danger. Unseen, Dumbledore watched. Ed's display had exposed one of his major assets. Yet revealing what people assume are all your secrets can sometimes help hide deeper ones. Ed was good. Of course, he would attract the attention of other professors and Dumbledore himself. They must be wondering what a young wizard like him was hiding. Like Tom Riddle before him, prodigious talent often came with mysteries. Dumbledore, suspecting the possibility of darker influences or secret studies in the dark arts, could be testing him, seeing if Ed's rise held the same kind of hidden, dangerous power. The cawing swelled. A dark figure with a red tail feather darted back through the window and landed on Ed's shoulder. The Red Bishop cawed twice, then flew ahead to lead. Ed and the others followed. Harry and Ron exchanged relieved glances. This plan was working. Those already running picked up speed and surged after the bird. Oddly, the corridors were unnaturally empty. No Gryffindor prefects, no house ghosts. No one stood in their way. Other students had returned to their dormitories under their prefect's watch. Yet this path felt deliberately cleared, as if others were actively avoiding them. Ed suspected this was Dumbledore's doing, though he didn't know which professors were cooperating. Maybe Snape had been enlisted. Dumbledore trusted Snape more than most. And McGonagall and others, with their personalities, might not be inclined to cooperate. If events unfolded as planned, Snape would likely be among the first teachers to appear at the scene after the crisis. Dumbledore's confidence in Snape, despite Snape's unpleasantness, was something Ed understood. Dumbledore did not want Lily's son to come to harm. Thoughts and roots sharpened in Ed's mind. He picked up his pace. After dashing down several corridors, the Red Bishop suddenly stopped and issued an urgent warning cry. Everyone picked up on the alarm. From the far end of the passage came a roar and a terrified girl's scream. "It's Hermione!" Harry's face drained of color. He snatched up his wand and sprinted. Ed and the others followed close behind. They rounded a corner and saw the troll swinging its massive club. Ahead of it, a young witch fled in sheer panic. Hermione, her face a mask of terror. Apparently, she had been heading to the Halloween feast, complaining about being late, when she stumbled into the path of a tall, shaggy troll. The creature grinned with a feral delight. Its huge club smashed down again and again. Each swing missed Hermione by inches, but the terror in every near miss was enough to unnerve anyone. Hermione ran, tripping over stones and skirting around debris, while the troll lumbered after her like a drunken boulder, the club crashing close enough to send splinters flying. Her screams echoed off the stone. "Damn it! Dumbledore really is inhuman," someone swore under their breath, staring at the unfolding nightmare. Ad complained silently to himself. Sometimes Dumbledore's way of handling things really was inhuman, utterly unconcerned if the whole affair would leave the little witch with lasting psychological scars. Isn't anyone worried Miss Granger might come away from this with a fear of magic? From Miss Know-It-All to Miss Know-Nothing? He thought. He drew his wand and shouted at the troll, "Incendio!" A fist-thick column of fire shot out and slammed into the troll's back. The troll stopped chasing Hermione. Ad hadn't used Stupefy. With the creature's magical resistance, a simple stunning spell would be useless. The fire charm wouldn't incapacitate it either, but it could wound and hurt, and crucially, it would draw the beast's attention. Just as he expected, the troll set up an angry roar, swung round, and glared at the small figures who dared to attack it. Hermione froze for a moment, then, seeing the familiar faces, screamed, "Run! Don't come over here." Ad ignored her. "Hermione, listen. Walk forward. There's a lavatory ahead. Get inside. Shut the door. Don't worry about anything else. I've already warned the professor. He'll be here soon." He barked to Harry and the others, "Follow me and cast Obstacle Curse." Harry, Ron, and Neville reacted instantly, pulling out their wands and shouting with Ad, "Obstacle Curse." Even at Ad's level, a single obstacle curse could hardly stop a troll or repulse it. The creature's resistance to magic, the kind that could maim or kill adult wizards, wasn't something ordinary spells could overcome. In the books, Ron knocking a troll out with a levitation charm was pure fantasy. If a levitation charm could topple a troll, Ad would eat the entire basic charms textbook. But when several of them cast Obstacle Curse at once, the troll's charge stuttered, as if it had run into an invisible wall. The immense beast froze, roaring. Ad showed no fear. He knew it was almost impossible for a young wizard to repel a troll by magic alone. That was why Harry and the others had to support him. These students couldn't be allowed to be trampled. One sweep of that club, and the lot of them would be finished. With their low levels, the best they could do was try to slow the troll with Obstacle Curse while someone drew its attention. That someone would be him. He felt a strange eagerness rather than fear. His contract with Red Bishop Miss and Black Knight Miss had gifted him with exceptional strength, agility, speed, sharp eyesight, and a finely tuned sense of magic. He'd always been physically superior to ordinary people, and most wizards, a low-spec little Superman among beginners. Since arriving at Hogwarts, his magic had surged, and even his 2 contracted ravens had strengthened wildly. The usual rapid growth of a young wizard's magic had been amplified in him. In a few months, he thought, he might even rival Hagrid in sheer physique. If Hagrid, with his build and a giant club, could handle a troll alone, Ad felt he wasn't entirely helpless either. He stepped forward and fired another fire charm straight into the troll's mouth. Incendio! His incendio had been improved to level 5 and was now one of his most powerful charms. A blast of flame was forced into the troll's mouth. Even with its high defenses, having a ball of fire shoved inside was enough to make the creature howl and clutch its face. All of its rage focused on Ad. It stamped its foot, roaring with pain and fury. The troll was no longer the clumsy, stumbling thing that had chased Hermione. It moved with a surprising swiftness that belied its bulk, and its club came down toward Ad with terrifying force. From behind him came several voices. Obstacle curse! A cluster of obstacle curses hit the troll and bought a precious moment. Nothing more. Ad rolled across the ground. The club's arc was huge, and dodging left or right would still leave him in range. He could only roll forward or back to avoid the blow. Rolling backward wasn't safe either. The club could still sweep him. So he risked rolling toward the troll's face. As he dropped forward, the rush of air from the club whistled past. The troll's vicious face loomed in front of him, and he could smell the foul stench of its burnt mouth. Chapter 91. There must be something wrong with such a tough giant. Ed switched his wand into his left hand and launched himself 3 meters into the air. Facing the troll's lowered, ugly face, he snapped a high kick up and slammed his heel into its chin. With a sickening boom, he could almost hear teeth crack. The troll's mouth had already been singed by incendio, like biting down on a small bomb, and now, from that powerful kick, several teeth shattered and blood poured from its mouth. If it had been a human, an upward strike to the chin could have been devastating. Even a child might daze an adult with that kind of hit. Not to mention Ed's near-superhuman strength. The kick made the troll stagger. Against an ordinary person or a weaker magical creature, that blow might have been fatal. But the troll only shook its head, clutched its bleeding mouth, and fixed its small, angry green eyes on Ed. The club in its hand came down with murderous force. Damn, this is a lot more exciting than a street fight, Ed muttered inwardly, marveling at the troll's resilience. The troll's build looked human enough that he'd assumed its weaknesses would be similar, and he'd aimed for the quickest disabling move he could think of, a powerful high kick to the chin. It hadn't worked as he expected, and instead had only enraged the creature. A harsh cry split the air. The red bishop swooped down, its razor claws raking the troll's face. When it pulled away, a spray of blood had erupted, 3 long, bloody slashes running from forehead to eye. The bird squeezed its claws, and a tiny pea-sized eyeball popped under its grip. The troll howled, clamped a hand to its injured eye, and lashed out with its club at the bird. But the red bishop was too agile. It flipped and darted out of the way, circling above the troll and emitting scornful cries as if mocking the lumbering brute below. Whether magical creatures could truly communicate wasn't clear, but the troll seemed to understand. Its rage deepened. Ed took his chance to draw his wand again and cast Petrificus Tallus at the troll's leg. He'd realized the creature wasn't something he could obliterate with 1 or 2 spells, and when brute force failed, control was the best tactic. Stupefy was out of the question. Even if he kept blasting Stupefy, this troll wouldn't go down unless 4 or 5 wizards of similar strength focused it together. His Stupefy was only LV2, not high enough. Petrificus Totalis was also LV2, and it probably wouldn't freeze the troll completely, but it could numb the leg enough to slow it. Reduce its mobility, and its huge club wouldn't be able to sweep the battlefield so freely. Harry, Ron, and Neville watched with pounding hearts, but felt powerless. They did as Ed had instructed, sending one obstacle curse after another from a safe distance to hamper the troll's movements. They were reckless, yes, but they had combat instincts. They understood most of their charms would only tickle the troll. Still, their curses could at least pin it down a little and help Ed. They were shocked by how capable Ed was. They'd known he was strong and heard his boasts about beating 20 little wizards alone. Now it seemed he could take on far more. But his fighting style was nothing like a wizard's. It wasn't magic dueling at all. For Ed, the situation was far worse than it looked. Sweat beaded on his forehead. There wasn't a moment to wipe it away. The wounded troll had gone feral, smashing its club at anything in sight. The entire castle trembled. The chaos would soon draw the other professors, which was the only good news. The bad news was surviving the next furious attacks. One swing of that club nearly grazed him. The gust nearly knocked him over. He was sure that a direct hit would be catastrophic. Even if he didn't die, he'd lose half his life. Damn it, Dumbledore. Doesn't he see how critical this is? Ed grumbled inwardly. In the original story, Dumbledore had held back, but now that Ed had shown how strong he was, why was the headmaster still just watching? Ed couldn't help but marvel at Dumbledore's calm. He even wondered if the headmaster had secretly strengthened the troll with a buffing spell. This rampaging, nearly indestructible creature was simply too terrifying and too durable. Chapter 92, Raven's Woe. By Ed's reckoning, even a troll should have gone down by now, or at least looked like it was in trouble. Instead, the creature in front of him stood like a boss at full health, berserk and unstoppable. He couldn't believe it. He'd only muttered a few complaints. He usually didn't even dare show his face in front of the headmaster. So why was Dumbledore being so cold about this? Sighing, Ed barely had time to think before another giant club came crashing down. He rolled and cast Petrificus Totalis at the troll's foot. The effect was minimal, just a slight stutter in the troll's step. The Great Hall wasn't large. Hermione and Ron hadn't fled far, so Ed's dodging space was already limited. The spell only delayed the onslaught, buying him a heartbeat. Turning to run wasn't an option. Every battle in the games had taught him that if you're already in an enemy's face, backing away is the quickest path to getting killed. Unlike Harry and Ron, who could still escape from a distance, the troll's attention was locked on him now. One mistake, and he'd be hit from behind and ruined. Red Bishop dove from the sky toward the troll's remaining eye, but having lost one eye already, the creature had grown wary. Trolls are stupid, but they remember immediate danger. When the raven swooped in, the troll whipped its iron club, and the gust knocked Red Bishop off balance. The bird flipped through the air and was blown away by the burst of wind. From the sky, Red Bishop cawed, then circled behind the troll and ripped chunks of flesh from its neck. For a thick-skinned monster like that, it was barely an annoyance, just torn skin and useless pain. As long as the raven didn't blind its other eye, the troll ignored it. Ed knew then that Red Bishop alone wouldn't win this. Dumbledore still made no move. The troll only grew more furious after being wounded, its swings more brutal and frenzied. The floor was already pockmarked and smashed. Ed felt himself being driven into a corner, with fewer and fewer places to dodge. If Dumbledore didn't add 100 points to Ravenclaw after this, Ed swore he'd never forget the grudge. He figured the headmaster must be testing him. Old foxes were crafty, and maybe Dumbledore wanted them truly on their knees before intervening. He had no idea when Professor Flitwick and the others would arrive. As the troll hurled its club down in another whirlwind strike, a flock of black ravens suddenly burst in through the windows and hurled themselves at the creature's face. The troll swept huge hands through the air, crushing birds by the dozen. Still, the black spirits kept coming, fearless of death, and soon the troll's eyes were momentarily covered. Good opening. Ed saw the chance. The sight of the ravens being crushed made his blood boil. These birds had been raised and fed by him. He could call some of them by name. They were no match for Red Bishop in size or strength. The ordinary ravens could only stop a troll by laying down their lives. Dozens fell instantly, their blood darkening the air, black feathers fluttering down. Ed felt the sting of loss through the soul contract as Red Bishop screamed in the sky. From outside the hall, more and more ravens streamed toward them. "Damn it!" Ed shouted at the troll. "You think I have no way to deal with you?" Red Bishop, circling overhead, understood instantly. Ed fixed his gaze on the towering troll and let the magic inside him boil. The thorny pattern on his left chest flared with an eerie, blood-like glow. Shadows those of ravens shimmered across the crimson thorns, and his left arm began to flush the color of fresh blood. It was the first time he let the contract's power flow so freely. His heart pounded, as if something inside was about to burst. He closed his eyes and stopped holding the power back, letting the demon within him stir. Red Bishop condensed into a streak of red light and shot straight into Ed's chest. Immediately, a searing, blood-red radiance erupted from his chest, hot enough that even his robes couldn't hide the gleaming thorned emblem that now shone through the fabric. Chapter 93. Release the Demons. "What is that thing?" Harry and Ron, standing beside him, stared at Ed in shock, then felt the terrifying, dangerous aura pouring off the boy. Ed, already larger than the other little wizards, suddenly grew another size. His arms warped, a layer of scale-like patterns and wrinkles forming along his fingers until his hands resembled twin raven staves. Feathers sprouted across his skin, densely covering his exposed flesh until he looked like a giant humanoid raven. Worst of all were his eyes. Once full of reason and wisdom, they had turned blood-red and vicious. With a tearing sound, a pair of enormous wings burst from his back. This was the power he had received from the monastery lord, Evil Radiance. The final form of the Raven Summoner, a complete release of the contract with the Raven Spirit, a fusion that elevated him to an ultimate state. Ed's height surged from just over a meter to more than 2. His wizard robes were shredded, but thick black feathers cloaked his body, sparing him the shame of tattered clothes. He'd become something no longer like a little wizard at all, but a little giant. The wings on his back unfurled to a span over 4 meters, as if blotting out the sun. Ed gave a low cry that was no longer human, but a harsh caw. At once, the ravens that had been rushing around blindly scattered, as if obeying a command. The troll, meanwhile, cruelly shoved a handful of ravens into its mouth and chewed them with the few remaining teeth in its huge jaws, keeping a wary eye on the unfamiliar creature that had just appeared. Ed didn't waste time talking. He tossed his wand aside, flicked his wrist, then beat his wings with a violent thrust and appeared in front of the troll, driving a heavy punch toward its head. The troll, ugly and clumsy, but still with fighting instincts, swung its club down without hesitation. The club whistled toward Ed, forcing him to abandon the punch and dodge with a sharp sidestep, then kick out. His foot had already become a raven's claw, slashing across the troll's chest and carving a deep, bone-deep wound. Blood spurted like a fountain, but instead of slowing it, the sight only inflamed the troll's fury. It took heavy strides and charged. Ed felt the tremendous power coursing through his body and the drain of magic that came with it. In Evil Radiance, he was astonishingly strong. The Raven Spirit's contract allowed him to draw on its power in every way, and combined with the Red Bishop's influence, an affinity for blood and death, he had enormous strength, uncanny agility, and razor-fast reflexes. The fusion with the Raven Spirit amplified all those traits. With a mere flick of his wings, he seemed to teleport beside the troll and slammed another blow into its chest, sending it stumbling back. Even so, the troll didn't fall. Ed couldn't help but admire the thick hide and tough flesh of such a creature. After merging with the Raven Spirit, Ed's strength felt 3 to 5 times what it had been, but it still wasn't enough to finish the beast. If he had the Raven Staff from the game, with its 50% armor penetration, a single blow to the troll's head would have split it open. But he had no way to bring such an item into his current body space. A massive staff appearing out of nowhere would be inexplicable. He had to fight bare-handed. As Ed dodged another club strike, Harry and Ron's shouts rang out behind him. "Ed, look out!" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. The troll's attack pattern was simple. Though the club was powerful, he thought he had gauged its range well enough to dodge it. But along with Harry and Ron's warning came a sudden, lethal awareness in his gut. There was no time to ask what had triggered it. Instinct from countless battles took over, and Ed kicked backward. In an instant, a brutal force struck him, hurling him through the air and slamming him into the basement wall. A human-shaped crack split the plaster. Ed felt his sternum collapse as blood poured from his mouth and his vision blurred. He hardly had a moment to process it before he stumbled away from the wall and hurled himself to the side. Where he had just been, something fierce crashed into the stone. If he hadn't dodged, that blow would have pinned him under its weight. His speed advantage would have been worthless. Only then did Ed understand what the warning had been about. The troll had dropped its club and thrown a punch. Ed had been pressing into a blind spot to avoid the club's arc, and he never expected the troll to abandon its greatest weapon and meet him with bare fists. No, the troll hadn't lost his greatest advantage. Even without his club, his raw physical power was still far beyond that of an ordinary person. If Harry, the others, and my own split-second reaction hadn't intervened, that punch, without the cushion of my kick, would have smashed into my head. Whether I'd live or die after that would depend entirely on Headmaster Dumbledore's conscience. I wiped spittle from my mouth and tasted copper. It felt as if my chest had been cleaved open. I forced myself to swallow. Blood sprayed from my lips, and at the same time the power of the Black Knight began to surge through my veins, doing its best to suppress the worsening injuries and keep the wounds from tearing open further. As a raven who wielded blood and death, I could normally rely on the Black Knight's gifts to mend my body by devouring fresh flesh and blood. After my fusion with the Red Bishop, even though it had been the Red Bishop I bonded with, the Black Knight's restorative aspects were amplified as well. It still wasn't a miracle cure that would patch me up instantly in the middle of a fight, but it could delay the damage and stop the wounds from widening. The troll's enraged punch had smashed the wall in front of him. He charged at me again. I wanted to complain. Dumbledore, Professor, how could a troll be this strong? Not even a dragon hatchling should be this outrageous. This troll looked a touch larger than normal. I wondered if some potion or enchantment had beefed him up. It was possible. These could be specialized troll guards assigned to protect the Philosopher's Stone, inherently stronger than ordinary trolls and equipped for combat. Any full-grown witch or wizard facing one alone would be courting suicide. As I braced to dodge, I saw small figures racing toward us at the edge of my vision. "Don't come here! I can handle him!" I shouted. But Harry and the others didn't listen. They ran straight at the troll. "Over here! Over here, you great oaf!" the troll bellowed. He was furious and primed on me, but he also noticed the group of young wizards charging in. He kicked up a collapsed stone pillar, and a rock the size of a millstone flew toward Harry and the others. They rolled and just barely avoided it, but the flying debris still sprayed them with splinters of stone. Their faces went pale. Neville was hit in the leg and tumbled to the ground. His leg bent in a way that made it look broken. Seeing the Gryffindor kids rush in like that, reckless, stupid, and brave all at once, I couldn't help feeling moved and terrified. They had seen how badly I'd been hurt by the troll's blow and had run up to help even though they were clearly outmatched. If they had simply stood back and obeyed my orders, they could have cast spells from range. But if they had been willing to stand idly by while I was in danger, they wouldn't be the Harry I knew. I couldn't blame them. I squared my teeth and started to force myself forward to draw the troll's full attention. Even weakened as I was, I could probably take 1 or 2 more hits. I just needed to keep him focused long enough for Professor Flitwick and the others to arrive. I couldn't hold out much longer. I no longer expected Dumbledore to show mercy. That old man gave no quarter. Another worry gnawed at me. Under the influence of the evil radiance, my magic was bleeding away. I was only a little wizard of just over 10 years old, at an age when magic in my body was still rising fast. Even with the magic affinity potion, my magical reserves were high for my age, but they were nothing compared to what I'd have when fully grown. The Red Bishop and Black Knight had grown in step with me and likewise benefited from the potion. The fusion with the evil radiance made them stronger, but it also made my body consume magic at a terrifying rate. It felt like a massive pump was frantically sucking the life out of my magical core. How long could I keep this up? I didn't know. At that moment, Harry, Ron, and even Neville, who was grimacing on the ground with his leg obviously bent, raised their wands and shouted together at the troll's squinting, furious eye. Incendio! 3 columns of fire, each as thick as a fist, screamed toward the troll's remaining eye. He howled in pain, slammed his huge hand over his face, and collapsed to his knees with a thunderous crash, fist after fist hitting the stone. Blinded, the troll began smashing the ground blindly, flinging rocks and rubble wildly to either side. Harry and Ron seized the chance. They dove and scrambled, dragging Neville with them, and they fled as stones rained down. And for the first time in a long while, I saw a real opening. Chapter 95, Smash It For Me. Ed's eyes lit up. It wasn't surprising he had such keen combat instincts. After all, rebirth had given him a second chance, and he deliberately honed his fighting skills on the streets so dungeon runs would be easier. Still, to see Harry and the others, newly enrolled little wizards, make such decisive, correct choices in the middle of a fight astonished him. Harry, Ron, and Neville's plan had been risky, but they'd hit the moment perfectly. They'd paid a high price, but they'd crippled the troll's only remaining eye and given themselves a real chance. From now on, whether to fight or flee was their decision. Well done. If the timing hadn't been so inconvenient, he would have wanted to give them a thumbs up. The troll pounded the ground in fury, but this time his vision was pitch black. He tried to use his ears to find the buzzing insects, but all he could hear was a frantic caw, caw. Countless ravens circled the great hall, shrieking. The sound drowned out everything else. The troll flailed and grabbed at stones, flinging them toward the noise. Now and then, a raven that couldn't dodge in time took a stone and splattered blood across the ceiling. When the troll swung his fist down again, Ed felt something grab his arm. He'd moved like lightning and seized the massive limb, thick as a bucket. Humans, compared to many other creatures, have one great natural advantage in close combat beyond tools. Our body structure makes wrestling, slamming, and other grappling techniques devastating. Smaller creatures and animals usually can't withstand even a couple of such blows. Wrestling is one of humanity's most brutal, decisive arts. Ed rarely used that kind of technique. His strength was usually enough, and those moves could maim or kill if he misjudged them. But this troll had lost both eyes. There was no longer any need for caution. Blood spurted from Ed's wounds, staining his black feathers red. His hands, already having turned into sharp claws, dug into the troll's tough flesh. He planted his feet, braced his hips, and with a roar used his body as a fulcrum and the troll's arm as a lever. Muscles expanded like coiled steel. "Slam him!" he shouted. With a thunderous roar, Ed heaved and flipped the enormous monster over his shoulder, slamming it down in front of him. The impact shook the castle. Spiderweb cracks raced across the stone floor. Enchanted lamps shattered, windows exploded inward. The whole hall seemed to convulse. Professor Flitwick, the Black Knight, and a group of upperclassmen burst in, panic written across their faces. Snape limped in behind them, equally stunned. The troll's huge body flew up and landed with its head driven deep into the floor. The surrounding flagstones cracked beneath their weight. The troll twitched for a moment, then lay still. Ed had expended everything in the throw. He collapsed, blood pouring from him, a dull sheen of light ebbing from his form. One by one, the broad raven feathers on his back retracted, along with the claws and other plumage. A raven with a streak of crimson on its tail fell weakly beside Ed's head and stared at its master. Weakness washed over him. He fought to push himself up, clutched the Red Bishop to his chest, scanned the room, and called through the pain, "Harry, Ron, are you all right?" "They're all right." Dumbledore's gentle, aged voice answered in his ear. Relief flooded Ed. Good heavens, Dumbledore had finally appeared. He was breathing hard and still bleeding. When he tried to speak, a torrent of blood gushed from his mouth. Dumbledore looked him over, flicked his wand, and warmth and strength flowed back into Ed, stabilizing his wounds. Behind the half-moon spectacles, Dumbledore's calm eyes held something like admiration. "Mr. Ed," Dumbledore said quietly, "do not worry. Your friends are fine. You are the one most harmed." Harry and Ron rushed up, supporting a limping Neville, and Hermione, who'd been hiding in a distant corridor as Ed had told her to, came running too. She'd intended to wait in an empty classroom, but the thunderous roars had made her turn back. When she saw Ed and the slaughtered troll, tears burst from her like a downpour. "Wah!" she cried. "Ed, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. This is all my fault. You shouldn't have been put in danger." Hermione didn't know what to say. She'd always seen the others as her best friends. At Hogwarts, her sharp tongue made many classmates dislike her, but Harry, Ron, Neville, and Ed had always treated her as a friend, even when they were sometimes annoyed. She had never expected that, when danger came, her friends would rush back for her without a thought for their own safety. Chapter 96, Severus, you fart! Hermione, still trembling from the terror of being chased by the troll, was so overwhelmed she broke down in tears and threw herself into Ed Moriarty's arms, clinging to him as if she'd never let go. Dumbledore, watching, couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Miss Granger, you need to calm down," he said. "Mr. Moriarty is badly hurt. If you wish to thank him, wait until he's in the hospital wing." "Oh my goodness, what on earth happened?" Professor McGonagall demanded as she hurried in. She stared in disbelief at the devastated great hall, shattered stone everywhere, the walls and floor spattered and littered with bodies of ravens, and the enormous, foul-smelling creature sprawled across the floor. Her composure snapped back to stern professionalism. She saw Ed lying there, bleeding, Hermione clinging to him, and Harry, Ron, and Neville limping toward them. Her voice went hard. Ed Moriarty, Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, Ronald Weasley, Neville Longbottom, what do you think you were doing? McGonagall was livid. She had told them to obey the prefects and return to their common rooms. Instead, they had gone off to confront a troll. Do you understand the risk? If anything had happened to you, how would I explain it to your families? Her chest heaved with outrage. I will be writing to them. You will be punished under school rules. House points will be deducted. Be grateful this didn't end worse. Professor Snape's cold, venomous voice cut in, making the students flinch. These children, assuming they have some skill and flagrantly disobeying school rules. He fixed them with his usual gleam of malice. Harry needed no reminder of how much Snape disliked him. Snape would have preferred Harry back in the Muggle world, out of the business of prophecies and Dark Lords. Dumbledore's insistence that the Dark Lord would one day return only made Snape more suspicious of the entire plan. The idea that a child should face such a threat seemed to him preposterous. His hatred of Ed was different. Ed had cost Snape's Slytherin house the cup single-handedly. No matter how hard Snape looked for a reason to punish him, he couldn't find a way to take points from Ravenclaw. That made Ed all the more dangerous in Snape's eyes. Someone who provoked him, and yet would not yield to his punishments, had to be either utterly ruthless or terrifyingly clever. Snape's face went still and cold. I suggest we expel them all, he said. Such a blatant breach of school regulations cannot go unpunished. Break their wands and send them home for good. His gaze lingered on Ed, and the idea that a first-year bested a fully armed troll, especially in such a bloody way, strikes me as impossible. I suspect Mr. Moriarty is studying the dark arts in secret. Notify the Ministry immediately. Send this would-be dark wizard to Azkaban. As Snape and McGonagall vented, the students' faces fell. Even Hermione, muffled against Ed's chest, went suddenly pale. In her head, the worst-case scenario played itself out. She had ruined things for everyone. They were all to be expelled. Severus, enough of this nonsense, came a sharp, indignant voice. Professor Flitwick bustled forward, breathless and fuming. For his small stature and usually cheerful manner, the sight of him angry made the moment almost comical, except no one was laughing. Flitwick had drawn his wand and was pointing it at Snape as he scolded him without restraint. Whether it's dark arts or not, you of all people should know better. Stop spreading baseless accusations. If anyone knows about such things. Phileas, that's enough, Dumbledore cut in quietly, bringing Flitwick up short. Still, the little professor glared at Snape with undisguised anger. It wasn't hard to see why Flitwick was so offended. Snape's suggestion to brand Ravenclaw's most talented student in generations as a dark wizard could ruin the boy's future. The magic Ed had used earlier had been startling, blooded, eerie, but Flitwick didn't think it was dark magic. It felt less like the corrupting malignancy of the dark arts and more like some ancient ritual, perhaps blood-related. As an expert in charms and an avid student of old magic, Flitwick had seen hints of something similar in ancient texts. That was why he had reacted so fiercely. And yet no one was surprised, in a way, by Snape's voice of scandal. Among the staff, the truth about Severus Snape's past was known. He had once been a Death Eater. Chapter 97. Explain. It was only because Professor Dumbledore trusted him so completely and had vouched for him that Professor Flitwick, in a burst of indignation, nearly let slip Severus Snape's biggest secret. Ed looked at the outraged little man with a complicated expression. He could easily guess what Flitwick was about to say. He was genuinely moved by the professor's unreserved defense. Dumbledore, meanwhile, turned to McGonagall, who was momentarily at a loss for words, shook his head and said, "Very well. Although what they did this time was indeed dangerous, it was for a reason, and they cannot be punished according to the usual school rules. Expulsion is out of the question." Dumbledore shot a warning look at Snape, who was about to interrupt. That was enough to make Snape fall silent. Hearing that they would not be expelled, Harry, Ron, and Neville finally felt their wits returning, even though the pain from their injuries still stung. One by one, they looked to Dumbledore, waiting for his next ruling. Before Dumbledore could speak, Ed, propping himself up as best he could, coughed up another mouthful of fresh blood. The sight made everyone uneasy. Ed nonchalantly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, coughed again, and then, feeling a little better, forced himself to explain. "I'm very sorry, Professor Dumbledore, but this couldn't be helped." Miss Granger, through overstudying, had nodded off at her table before the feast and missed the banquet, so she didn't know the troll had come. We were afraid she might run into it on her way, so we had no choice but to go find Hermione. He paused, then hurried on before McGonagall could speak. "We thought of getting a teacher from her house, but the situation was urgent, and there wasn't time. I sent my crow to Professor Flitwick to ask for help and set my other crows to locate Hermione and the troll in the castle. When the crow came back, Hermione was being chased. We couldn't wait. We had to go help our friend." Ed had deliberately rearranged the sequence of events to sound as if the news of Hermione being chased had prompted them to rush out. It was obvious to Harry, Ron, Hermione, and the others what had really happened, but none of them corrected him. Ed knew Dumbledore couldn't be fooled, but Dumbledore chose to let the small deception pass. He nodded, pretending not to notice the sleight of hand, and turned to Flitwick. "Is that right, Phileas?" Flitwick suddenly seemed to remember something. He hopped up, rummaged through his robes, and produced a crumpled scrap of paper. "That's right," he said. "This child sent his crow as soon as the incident happened, and that's why I hurried over. I arrived at almost the same time as Severus." The implication was clear. What Severus had seen, Flitwick had seen too, so Severus would do well not to slander the boy in front of his students. Dumbledore read the note with a satisfied nod. Then, turning to McGonagall, he said, "You can't blame these children for rushing to save a friend. In fact, because of their courage, we were spared losing a clever little witch, and we avoided a terrible incident at Hogwarts. Their actions were brave and noble." McGonagall, though she had spoken sternly about punishing rule-breakers, had no intention of seeing them truly ruined. Under other circumstances, their offenses could have led not only to expulsion, but to broken wands or worse. Her talk of deducting points and giving detention was as much protection as she could offer without losing face. Snape, by contrast, was unforgiving. He seemed determined to crush Harry and the others, including Ed, for reasons Ed could never figure out. McGonagall's tone shifted to concern as she looked the students over. Harry and Ron seemed bruised and scraped, but otherwise all right. Neville had a broken leg. Ed, however, looked alarming. Much of his skin had been torn, and his clothes were almost completely shredded from a prior transformation. He had managed to pick up a few relatively intact scraps of robe to cover himself, but the huge thorn-like pattern that stretched from his chest to his left wrist was exposed for the first time. The thorn pattern, having just used its power, glowed with a faint red light like the reflection of blood. As everyone's attention fixed on the crimson thorns, they seemed to hear a distant caw and catch a flicker of a crow-shaped shadow. Not even these experienced professors had seen anything like this magic before. If they hadn't sensed that there was no trace of dark arts aura about it, they might have suspected the boy had been dabbling in forbidden magic. Dumbledore studied Ed with careful eyes, lingering on the blood-red, thorny pattern across his chest. Ed met his gaze without flinching. With so many witnesses present, Dumbledore could not press his legitimacy to full strength, and after the steadying effect of the soul crystal, Ed's mind was unusually stable. He was confident that Dumbledore would not be able to pry anything from him by simply looking into his eyes. After a moment, Dumbledore's attention slid from Ed's eyes to the mark on his chest. He considered it thoughtfully and then said, "Rest assured, Severus, this is not dark arts. If I am not mistaken, it appears to be an ancient form of transfiguration linked to sacrificial ritual work, a sort of transfiguration ritual hybrid." He paused, then continued, "Perhaps Mr. Ed is not truly from a Muggle family, but carries the blood of some obscure ancient wizarding house. The most secret inheritances can pass down by blood and manifest only in extraordinary descendants, much like Parseltongue in Slytherin's line. Mr. Ed may have awakened an ancestral legacy. Dumbledore's casual classification made Ed's magic out to be transfiguration. Coming from the most powerful wizard alive, his words were assurance enough to stop most people from calling Ed's powers dark arts. From then on, Ed's methods could be explained away and used openly. Ed knew Dumbledore's theory was a stretch. He knew exactly how he'd gained the ability, but the soul-feeding ritual did have ritualistic aspects. If anyone could plausibly call it ancient ritual magic, it would be Dumbledore. Since the headmaster was willing to cover for him, Ed did not contradict him. Snape snorted, displeased. He clearly resented that Ed and the others had not been summarily expelled. Dumbledore, however, smiled and waved his wand. Shreds of ruined robe rose from the floor and drifted through the air, knitting themselves together until a serviceable robe settled over Ed. The charm was far more thorough than a simple mending charm could explain. It demonstrated Dumbledore's extraordinary mastery of charms. No wonder he was considered the greatest wizard of their time. With a mischievous smile, he addressed Hermione, who had been clinging to Ed and trembling. "Very well, Miss Granger. You may let Mr. Ed go now. I should hate for his barely recovered injuries to be aggravated by your grip." Hermione flushed, embarrassed, and reluctantly released Ed, though she still looked unnerved. Dumbledore glanced around at the gathered professors and the growing crowd of students who had poured into the corridor after hearing the commotion. Once the racket reached the castle, everyone had rushed over. Some arrived sooner, some later. "This incident is, at bottom, a serious error on the part of the staff," Dumbledore went on, his tone solemn. "To allow such a ferocious troll to wreak havoc within the castle, that is my failing as headmaster. But it is fortunate," he added, "that Mr. Ed, Mr. Harry Potter, Mr. Ron Weasley, and Mr. Neville Longbottom arrived in time to prevent irreparable harm." He looked at Hermione, who was dabbing at her eyes, and smiled. "To compensate Miss Granger for the fright she endured, I shall, by virtue of my office, award 50 points to Gryffindor. I trust no professor will object." There was stunned silence among the staff. Dumbledore had begun by accepting blame for the breach of safety, a point the professors privately acknowledged, but the troll had been assigned to the school on his authority. No one dared to say that aloud. Severus gave a stiff, reluctant nod as Gryffindor's score ticked up by 50 points. A small, uneasy premonition crept over him. Dumbledore's gaze then found Harry, Ron, and Neville. "That was an impressive incendio," he said, voice full of warmth. "And your willingness to rush forward at the last moment to protect your friends shows the true Gryffindor spirit. I hope you will carry this memory, the courage to face danger, to save your companions, for the rest of your lives." He removed his glasses and rubbed at the corner of one eye, as if on the verge of tears. "For your bravery and self-sacrifice, each of you will receive 50 points for your house." Gryffindor's score surged by a further 150 points, instantly erasing the nearly 200-point deficit with Slytherin and putting them more than 10 points ahead. Chapter 99. "Oh no, Old Man Dumbledore wants to praise me to death!" In an instant, all the points Snape had painstakingly stripped from the little lions over the past month, points that had kept Gryffindor mired in third place, were wiped away by a few casual words from Dumbledore. Snape couldn't even object. Who argued with Dumbledore? A few professors quietly wondered if the headmaster had actually been stingy, given what Harry and the others had done. Ordinary adult wizards might not have shown such courage. Even Professor McGonagall's stern face softened. Those lions were infuriating, certainly, but at least they hadn't disgraced the house. As head of Gryffindor, she felt a flush of pride. If any of them had been seriously hurt, of course, she would have been furious, but they were only slightly injured. With Dumbledore present, none of this was a problem. Ed was a little speechless. He'd known it would end up like this. So they'd done all the hard work and taken the lumps, and now Dumbledore would be the one to look heroic, and to pile points on Gryffindor on top of it. "Thanks, Professor." As if reading his thoughts, Dumbledore turned and smiled at Ed in a way that made him wonder whether the headmaster had known he was standing there the whole time. It wasn't impossible. Dumbledore had always seemed to possess wisdom and perception far beyond other adults. "Difficult troll," Dumbledore said lightly, as if continuing a conversation. This troll was a security guard placed here for special reasons. In full armor, even a small team of well-trained aurors could be badly challenged if they met it unexpectedly. And more than that, he added, it was driven mad and made far more dangerous by a potion fed to it by someone unknown. That raised the threat level beyond what an ordinary professor could reasonably handle. He nodded, then joked, I believe Professor Quirrell's entrance has already impressed upon everyone how dangerous that troll was. Goodness. Dumbledore had dropped the pretense altogether, Ed thought inwardly. What he called a joke was practically an admission of complicity. Still, the headmaster suddenly smiled and grew serious. However, Mr. Ed Moriarty and Mr. Harry Potter, young wizards who have only been at Hogwarts a few months, have accomplished feats that would put many adult wizards to shame. They did not only save their companions, they directly confronted and overcame that troll in combat. That is an achievement worthy of being recorded in Hogwarts history. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled as he continued. For this, Mr. Ed Moriarty, Mr. Harry Potter, Mr. Ron Weasley, and Mr. Neville Longbottom will each receive a special contribution to the school award in recognition of your courage and excellence. The medals, engraved with your names, will be displayed permanently in the Hogwarts Badges Collection Hall, alongside those wizards who have rendered great service to this school throughout history. You have earned it. Ed, Harry, Ron, and Neville were momentarily speechless. They had visited the Badges Collection Hall on the 4th floor when they'd been arranging their duel with Malfoy. The medals there bore names they knew, wizards famous for their contributions to Hogwarts. For first years, to have their names enshrined among those honored was staggering. Harry and Ron could barely form a word. For students from traditional pureblood families, like Ron and Neville, having one's name in that room was something like the highest honor a current Hogwarts student could achieve. Unlike a house cup, which was shared, this was a personal monument, something to brag about for the rest of your life. Dumbledore watched their reactions with clear pleasure. He truly believed Ed and the others deserved the award. Their intervention had, at the very least, prevented Hermione from being gravely harmed and might have averted a catastrophe for the school. Even if they had acted recklessly, the result justified the recognition. Moreover, Dumbledore was at a point where he wanted to cultivate Harry's sense of responsibility and honor. This kind of recognition would do that work for him. Then Dumbledore turned directly to Ed. Of course, Mr. Ed made the most outstanding contribution of the four. He spread his hands as if presenting a prize. He displayed all the qualities an excellent Hogwarts student might possess: Gryffindor's courage and spirit, Hufflepuff's kindness and inclusiveness, Ravenclaw's wisdom and intelligence, and Slytherin's ambition and strategic wit. He is truly one of the finest students Hogwarts has seen in many years. Even Ed, who had known his own abilities, had trouble not blushing at that. Old Man Dumbledore, do you really have to sing my praises this loudly? He thought. I'm not as amazing as you say. Please don't go drawing Lord Voldemort's attention my way. With words like that, it sounded as if I could bring the four houses together and be crowned King of Hogwarts at any moment. Chapter 100. Oh no, Old Man Deng is trying to target me. With praise from Dumbledore like that, Ed could already picture tomorrow's headlines. By morning, every witch and wizard in Britain might know about this. He might even make the front page of the Daily Prophet. The Ministry would hear about him, the little wizard with limitless prospects in Dumbledore's eyes. Dumbledore, what are you trying to do? If you want to train your chosen one, fine. Train your chosen one. Why drag me into it? Didn't I say a few careless things about you when I was bored? Did you use legilimency on me during the battle and hear me bad-mouthing you? 1,000 messy thoughts crowded Ed's head as Dumbledore smiled and declared, For this, I believe Mr. Ed Moriarty has earned 200 points for Ravenclaw. I trust no one will object? 200 points. That was a lot. But Ed's objection was not about quantity. He objected in principle. Dumbledore had already handed out points earlier, and most of the big public rewards had gone to Gryffindor. Giving Ravenclaw 200 now was generous, yes, but it also felt like a consolation prize handed out after the fact. Ravenclaw was already ahead of Slytherin by a comfortable margin. With this, it would be almost untouchable by them. But Gryffindor had received points too. and Dumbledore still had Harry and his friends' future triumphs in his pocket, hundreds of points waiting to be doled out at the end-of-year feast. Ed could see it. Flitwick's Ravenclaw smiling through the day, only to have Gryffindor snatch victory in the last breath. Poor Professor Flitwick, Ed thought, after all those years as head of Ravenclaw, watching the cup slip away again. Dumbledore watched him watch the scoreboard. The old man had always been shrewd about people. He had misjudged only a few times in his long life, and each misjudgment had been costly enough to teach him well. Ed's expression shifted from calm to something tighter, and Dumbledore's eyes crinkled with amusement. "This is indeed a difficult child to please," he murmured to himself then, aloud and with a smile. "Of course, I think Mr. Ed Moriarty is not quite satisfied with these rewards." All eyes in the great hall swung to Ed. He felt his grin freeze. "I am not. Don't say that. Stop making me look guilty," he thought frantically. "Dumbledore, why are you making me a spectacle?" But Dumbledore only smiled, and then his tone softened. "It's not only Mr. Ed and those first years who put themselves at risk when danger came to Hogwarts, but also our newest friends here, these brave little ravens." The ravens were no longer circling and cawing above the ruined hall. They sat perched in the cracked ceiling and on twisted beams, a solemn, black-stilled audience. Where the light struck, their feathers glinted. Where the light didn't reach, there were the darker signs of the battle. Dead ravens, splatters of blood on the stone, feathers clinging to the rafters. The sight made a hush fall over the room. "Let us thank these friends for what they sacrificed for Hogwarts," Dumbledore said, bowing his head slightly, "for their loyalty, their courage, and their sacrifice." His invitation was enough. After a brief silence, the professors and students lowered their heads and mimicked his bow, a ripple of reverence washing across the great hall. Dumbledore continued, "These brave ravens will be laid to rest by Hagrid in the Owl's graveyard near the Forbidden Forest. Hogwarts will never forget what they have done for her." He turned back to Ed with a twinkle in his eye. "I believe this recognition will make you a little happier, Mr. Ed, won't it?" Ed's chest tightened. He met Dumbledore's gaze and saw the old man's habitual steadiness, an intelligence that had led him through countless trials, a softness beneath the iron. He had always thought of Dumbledore as resolute, almost unshakable. He had promised himself not to be moved by small gestures. And yet, looking at the solemn birds and the earnestness in Dumbledore's face, something rose unbidden in him, an ache at the sight of so much silent sacrifice. Around him, the others were visibly relieved and joyous. Harry and his companions had been celebrating their reprieve from expulsion. They had been almost giddy at the announcement of the Special Contribution Awards. The hall buzzed with the kind of noise that followed public reward and safety. But only Dumbledore had noticed the ravens who had quietly given everything for the battle. Ed swallowed. He told himself sharply not to be gullible, not to let the old man's words sway him. Yet the emotion swelled anyway, like a spring breaking through the surface. He felt his throat close and his eyes sting. For a moment he could do nothing but stand there, moved by the thought that someone had noticed the little creatures no one else had remembered. Dumbledore's smile deepened into something gentler, and the great hall, full of laughter and applause, bowed once more. Not just to the students and their feats, but to the small, dark witnesses who had paid the price for Hogwarts' safety.